Welcome back to Obsession Engineering and my little SP1 project. Today I'm going to be doing an engine service on it. So I have actually already drained the oil out of it, but I'm going a little bit more than oil and filter. I'm going to be doing a valve clearance check, putting some spark plugs in it, checking the air filters and bits like that, generally having a bit of a look around it, and then putting oil and coolant back in it. So that's it. I've got my overalls all ready. I better actually get cracking. As I need to get into the rocker covers, I need to get the fuel tank off, and on the Honda there is no sort of dry brake connector underneath the fuel tank for the fuel pipes, so I do need to take the majority of the petrol out of it. So we'll get that open and I'll get my little siphon pump on the go. You can buy these little siphon pumps for like two for $5 and they're terrible, or you can buy sort of a Draper or a Sealy one or something and they're about 10 quid each, and they're about 100 times better. So usual thing, you get what you pay for. So with the majority of the fuel drained out of the tank and the bolts undone at the front, the next thing to do is actually undo the electrical connector. So down the side panel, under there is a little black electrical connector. Just whip that one out, and then I need to lift the tank up. Using an appropriate length stay to hold the tank up in place, we can now get underneath here. So I need to pull off the connector, like the pipes that go down to the breathers and the water drains and bits. So there's one there, one there. There is a return from the fuel rail here as well, which is clipped on, and then I need to undo the big Allen key that holds the main like pressurized fuel line onto the tank, and then we can actually take the whole fuel tank off. I tell you what, I'm enjoying working on my VTR today, especially because it gives me another opportunity to be in my cold workshop wearing my lovely warm Obsession Engineering hat. If your head's cold, you ought to get to obsessionengineering.co.uk and buy yourself some lovely warm merch. For doing the valve clearances, I'm going to show you most of what's going on behind the rear rocker cover for the rear cylinder, because it's considerably easier for access for me to work in and also considerably easier to get the camera into. I've moved the fuel line and the breathers and bits out the way, so I've got reasonable access, and I just need to pull the pipe off here that is the pair valve. So basically that feeds fresh air into the exhaust port and is better for emissions, and then I can take the HT lead off and actually get the spark plug out. So the next bit of the job is pretty straightforward. A deep reach 16mm socket on an extension, and we can give that a tweak to undo it, and the spark plug was plenty tight enough, that's for sure. And it certainly wasn't going to fall out. And fishing the plug out was pretty easy. Got my magnet on a stick down the hole and got the plug out. And they're actually quite an unusual plug, especially for the Japanese. It's an FR9 BI11 and it's ball ended. So it's got a ball end, not the usual thread end on that. Why Honda have this tendency to put really weird spark plugs in bikes, I'm not sure. I think it's just so they think they're going to sell more spark plugs. With the plug out of the rear cylinder, the next thing I'm actually going to do is take the plug out the front cylinder, and then when we come to actually turning the engine over, it'll be a lot easier because we won't be compressing anything. Access to the front plug is pretty easy, especially with the oil cooler removed that I took off the other day. There is a little bit of dirt sort of around the collar on the front plug one, because obviously the front wheel is a bit more prone for throwing dirt towards there. So before I actually undid the plug, I did at least get an air line down it and just give it a little bit of a blow, so not too much loose dirt is still going to be in the plug hole, because obviously when you take the plug out you don't want it falling in the engine. For the next step, I either need to take off the access plug so I can get on the end of the crankshaft, or put the bike in gear. And to explain both of them, while we're doing the valve clearance check, we need to be able to turn the engine over so the cams are pointing up at different times. Generally, the best way of doing it is to use the bolt in the end of the crank to turn the crank. That's what it's designed for, that's what is an access point. If you don't want to take the cover off, if you've got a weird bike with no cover on it, you can put the bike in gear. 6 is easiest, and you can just jog the back wheel around and it will move the cams around. But I'm just going to take that out because it's easier. So with the little access point removed, I can get onto the bolt on the end of the crankshaft, and then if I turn that, it turns the engine over. So the next thing I need is access to the valves, which means I need to take the rocker covers off. A bit like when we take the spark plugs out, I want to clean any dirt off that's on the outside so it doesn't go on the inside. So I'm just going to get a rag and sort of wipe around the edge of the rocker cover, get any loose dirt out of the way. Right, the next step is incredibly Japanese. There are 3 bolts holding the rocker cover on, and they're different colours. Well, one of them is. This one in my hand is a different colour. They've plated it a different colour because it's actually a slightly different length. Now, how Japanese is that they've actually changed the spec on the bolt plating just so you don't confuse them? Genius. And with the bolts out, a little wiggle there, and we can get the rocker cover off. Just sticking a little bit on the rubber seal on this side, on the rocker cover seal on the gasket, and there we go, rocker cover off with the gasket mostly intact, and there we have some gear driven cam loveliness. Nice. So a couple of little things to note in here, and one of them is the sealant that has previously been used to seal the little sort of crescent half moons or whatever appears to be bathroom sealant or clear sealant. It doesn't look like normal crankcase sealant because it's the wrong colour. So we'll be peeling all of that off and putting some different sealant back on when we put it back together. That does at least tell me that somebody has been in here and at some point in its life it has had a valve clearance check, so that is probably a good thing, apart from probably using the wrong sealant. On a Ducati you would have cam belts for doing the cam timing, which need to be changed about every 2 weeks. The majority of bikes use chain-driven cams because a cam chain lasts a very long time, but for incredible accuracy at very high RPM, what you want is gear-driven cams. It costs a lot more to make it, it's more complicated, it's much more difficult if you want to skim heads and stuff like that, but it is much better at incredibly high RPM because you don't get any slack in anything. On the Honda, to reduce the noise on the cam drive, you have these quietening gears. So the little sort of quarter-size gear on the front here is sprung-loaded to the back gear, because otherwise at tick over or at low RPM you'd actually get a bit of sort of backlash between the gears. Obviously, if they were a very, very tight match between the gears and the ones they drive to, when they got hot they would bind together, or when they were cold they would clatter. So there had to be a bit of a clearance, and so to stop the sort of rattle you have these quietening gears on it. And this little thing that's stuck up here is actually the cam position sensor point. So the cam position sensor is sat down here, and this basically triggers a little hall sensor which tells the bike where the cam is, and then it knows when to inject the fuel or when to spark, and therefore when to actually go bang bang. So now I can get access to the end of the crank, and I have access to the camshaft. What I need to do is turn the engine over. So in the normal direction of rotation, turn the crank, camshafts move at half the speed the crank is moving, and basically what I'm looking for is the lobe sticking mostly upwards, so that the base circle, the sort of whole section here that's not actually got any sort of cam valve opening action on it, is against the bucket, the bit down here, and then we can get a feeler gauge underneath that and check the clearance. So because this is V-twin, there will be a specific point where you can just set the cams so you can get all the clearances in one go. But it doesn't really matter if you do them one by one or all at the same time. To me, it takes the same length of time, and so while they're in a perfect position, I'm just going to measure them. So that's a 0.25 feeler gauge, and it goes in relatively easily. So we're not particularly small. Right, I'll get a 0.3 and see if that fits. Right, a 0.3 feeler gauge doesn't fit in either of them, so I'm going to say that's pretty much 0.28. The exhaust is quite a big clearance compared to the inlet as well. The exhaust is 0.3 or 0.31 plus or minus 0.03. The inlet is 0.16 plus or minus 0.03 again. And basically that's because obviously when the engine's running, the exhaust valve gets very hot and expands a lot more, so therefore you need a bigger clearance to begin with. So now that I'm happy with my exhaust clearance, I'm just going to turn the engine over a little bit more until I get my inlet cam in a sensible position, and there looks ideal to me. And exactly the same thing, just get my feeler gauges under there, see what the clearance looks like. Right, a 0.15 does not fit, so we're going to be on the smaller end of the clearance again, but generally on Japanese stuff the clearance will be set generally to the smaller end because it'll run quieter. So we'll go in with a 0.1 feeler gauge, and that goes in. You can see that moves really quite easily in there. Trying the other one even easier. So I'd be happy that they're 0.12, 0.13, so they're pretty much on bottom tolerance, but that's okay for me. There is of course also the argument that if you run on bottom clearance you actually get more valve lift because you've got less clearance to take up, so you'll get maybe a couple of degrees of extra sort of cam opening and an extra tiny fraction of a millimetre more valve lift. So if you're chasing the last horsepower, a small clearance might be the best swing to have. Except of course then if everything's running a bit hot and you run out of clearance completely and end up with no clearance, then you lose compression and you lose power. So it's up to you. I think we'll just stick inside the manufacturer's recommended tolerances for now. Right, this 3-bond stuff is the correct sealant for sealing up crankcases and basically anything on an engine. Normal sealant and stuff is not the correct thing to use, mostly because this actually sticks much better, and so you don't end up with bits of it stuck in your oil strainer blocking your oil passages up. So we're just going to put a little thin smear of this in the correct places on the cylinder head and pop the cover back on. So we're not looking for loads and loads of sealant, just a little bit, because all we're doing is filling in any little gaps that the gasket might leave. So the stuff I've got on my finger is actually really a little bit too much, and we can use it in a couple of different places. And then afterwards, when I'm happy I've got sealant everywhere, we'll give it a bit of a clean off, because we don't want to have a load of sealant sticking around everywhere looking untidy. With the rubber gasket in place on the rocker cover, we can just slot that back on, pop the bolts in it, give it a nip down. So that's the easy cylinder done, except I need to put the spark plug back in, but after I've done the front cylinder because I still need to turn the engine over. So that means it's time to get on with the awkward one. So doing the front cylinder is the same routine as doing the rear one, except it's more awkward to get to. I mean, at least it's Japanese, so there is a reasonable amount of space around here. It's not a Ducati, so you're not having to do the valve clearances through a hole in the dark, basically like doing gynecology from a distance. The only thing on the front cylinder is there is a pair valve feed, like a air feed into here, that's Jubilee clipped up here, so I need to take that off first before I undo the rocker cover bolts. The third rocker cover bolt is over the top here, but you can get to it. It is just a little awkward. And because it's awkward and I really need 2 hands, I'll talk to you in a minute once I've finished it. So getting the front rocker cover off was awkward. The valve clearances were all absolutely fine, because it's a Honda, and then putting the rocker cover back on has turned into an even bigger clat. The biggest problem is up here, there is a pair valve pipe, and trying to get that in the right place and then pushed back onto its stub pipe is proving especially awkward. And so what I'm going to do is tackle it a different way by taking that radiator off, because I'm going to change the coolant anyway, so I may as well actually take the thing out the way that's causing me the most problem for access and make my life a little bit easier. The easiest way to drain the water out of this is going to be undoing that pipe there, just pulling the pipe off, because that appears to be the lowest point on the cooling system. And here we go. Squeeze the pipe off, get the bucket in a good position, and in a minute, woo! She's got good flow on her. Might need to go for a pee in a minute. Instead of moving the radiator completely, I've managed to just loosen the bolts on it, take the top pipe off that feeds onto the inside of the radiator and just push it out of the way, and that's given me just enough access to be able to push on the pipe that I needed to get that went on the breather box on the back of the rocker cover. That has been a bit of a clat. So it turns out most of this bike is very, very Honda, and every now and again they'll take one piece of inspiration from Ducati. Ha ha! We shall get them, we shall play a trick on them and make something slightly awkward. The little tinkers. After the fun and games that were everything to do with rocker covers and radiators, putting spark plugs in is the easy bit. Put it down the hole, screw it in with your socket. I did actually check if you've got an SP2 they are different plugs. So everything I've said earlier is irrelevant if you have an SP2. So, spark plugs back in, pair valve piping and everything reconnected. The next thing I want to do up the top of the engine is check the air filters. So I'm just going to buzz this cover off, screws out, electrical connector off, take the cover off, and hopefully the air filters are fairly clean because they have not been ordered as replacement parts in with all the other service bits I've done. So I have my fingers crossed. With the airbox lid off, it's just a case of undoing the screw back here, which is captived inside this little bracket at the back, and then you can wrestle them out the airbox. They are a little bit of a fiddle to get out, if I'm honest, because they're snug in there. And looking down inside the filter material, these are not particularly clean. So I'm guessing when this was recommissioned not that long ago, or in mileage wise, either nobody checked them or they certainly didn't bother replacing them. So they're, you know, not terrible, so they can go back in for now, but I am going to order a set. And luckily, it's not the end of the world to change them. You can just lift the tank up a little bit, and you should be able to actually get just enough access to get in there and change them. So for now, they're going to have to go back in, but at least I know I need to order some new ones. Now that we're into the putting things back together stage, we can actually start putting fluids back in the bike. But there was one thing I had to do before that, and it was put the oil cooler back on and put the little plug in the side cover. So that's actually two things, isn't it? Never mind. Maths was never my strong point. So, oil cooler refitted with the sort of cleaned up and lacquered pipes. So they're not perfect close-up. This is not a concourse, but they are considerably better. I've had a little bit of a clean around the front of the motor and places like that as well. And I actually thought, oh no, the horn has got some rust on it. It hasn't. It's actually the original plastic cover from when the bike was new. So that can stay on there. I've Loctited the bolts in where the oil cooler pipes go in, and the O-rings are in good condition. So that's all happy days. The last thing I need to do to drain any last bits of fluid out is take the oil filter off, and for that I'm going to use my big grips. Big pair of grips, and that was pretty straightforward. I know that oil filters are not supposed to be mega tight, but I tend to do them fairly tight because you don't want them leaking. I'll fish that out of there later. I have my new oil filter, but it would look better with oil in it and soaking, so I've got some Motul 300V to go in it. We're on 1040 because that's what these bikes are supposed to have. I prefer to run a fully synthetic oil even if the bike doesn't strictly need it because, well, basically it's better and it actually lasts longer, so there's no reason not to use it, and 300V is awesome, so that's what we're going to put in it. Wow, look at that lovely green loveliness. Splendid. Before I put my freshly primed oil filter back on, I am actually going to refit my sump plug so the oil doesn't fall back out the bike. I have a bit of an admission, I don't always change the sealing washer, the copper or aluminium washer that's on the sump plug. You can use them a couple of times and this one looks fine. So that can go back in down there, tighten that up, and then we can actually put some oil in it. So I like to prime the filter up so that it has oil in it, so that when we hit the start button, it's a little bit quicker building its oil pressure. It might only be, you know, half a second or a second difference, but every little can count. So with some oil in there, it's time to screw it back onto the motor. And in theory, that should be about tight enough. But I'm always paranoid about oil filters coming undone, so that's now tight enough. And I'm a lot happier about that. Next stage is to put the oil in it, and normally at this point I'd put the bike on a front paddock stand so it was actually sat level, so that getting the sight glass level right was a bit more accurate. But I can't actually run the bike at the moment to set the oil level when everything's settled down because I don't have the gaskets for the exhaust system. So for today, what I'm going to do is fill it up and basically fill it up just about to the top of the sight glass, and then when I've got the exhaust pipes back and I can actually run the bike up to temperature and get the oil back in the cooler and stuff, then we'll get the bike level and actually set it properly. So for now, we'll just pour oil in it. In preparation for putting some Motul MotoCool antifreeze in the bike, I've put it on its side stand. Basically that just leans the bike over a little bit, which means the radiator cap is then the highest point on the system, so it pushes the air locks and the air bubbles and bits out of it a little bit easier. Right, get the rad cap open and get some good stuff in there. That is the radiators full. I'm just going to sort of lower the bench down, take the bike off its side stand and lean it over as far as I can, sensibly lean it just to give it a bit of a chance to move any more air bubbles this side of the bike. It's also not a bad idea to just go through and massage your hose a little bit, give them a bit of a tweak, because that might help get a little bit more of a spurt out. Massaging your hose. So I've had the bike off its side stand and actually noticed that when I leaned it more upright and a little bit past upright, that burped a little bit of air in. So it's obviously just the way that this bike obviously wants to flow its water is maybe a little bit different with having the side mount radiators or whatever. So I've had it a bit more leant over side stand side, I've had it a bit more than upright towards me, and I've just kept topping it up. When I first run the bike, when I've got the exhaust pipes and everything back for it, then what I will do is obviously run it, take the rad cap off again when it cools down, double check the fluid level, same with the oil. Once it's run, actually get it dead upright, check the oil level in it, set the levels, and then think about putting bodywork on it. But that's a job for another day. I've also drained and refilled the coolant / antifreeze header tank. It does look like it's still got old green coolant in it, but that's unfortunately because it's actually stained the inside of the bottle and I can't get it out. But trust me, that has got new antifreeze in it as well. And so that is basically it for engine servicing the SP1. Okay, I can't actually run the bike to set the oil and coolant levels in it, and I haven't got any new air filters for it, but you get the gist of how everything actually works. And so hopefully you've enjoyed watching it, and join me again next time for some more motorbike fun.